David Sklare, whom we all know because we all use his work, and David Sklare is for Hafakot, David Sklare, the productions, and the many projects that he was responsible for, is still responsible for some of them in terms of cataloging and identification of materials, and so as a result, everyone knows him. And his institutional affiliation with the Ben Tzvi Institute. We'll talk about Ysrael Ben-Daniel's Sefer Mitzvot.
As is well known, the Firkovich collections of manuscripts have preserved large parts of the Karaite legal literature written in Judeo-Arabic, works produced from the 10th through the 15th centuries. It is possible to reconstruct from these manuscripts large parts of books of law written by central Karaite authors such as Al-Kirkisani, Yefet ben Eli, Sal ben Matzliach, Levi ben Yefet, Yusuf al-Basir, Yeshua ben Yehuda, Sal al-Tustari, Shlomo Hanassi, Yefet ben David al-Saghir, and Shmuel ben Moshe ha-Maghribi. In addition, there are to be found works of lesser-known authors and those who still remain anonymous. Of these books, only Kirkisani's Kitab al-Anwar al-Marakib has been made easily available to researchers and students thanks to Leon Nemoy's truly heroic efforts. The lack of progress made in reconstructing, translating, and publishing these works is largely due to the rather small group of people who work with Karaite Judeo-Arabic literature, and even smaller group of people who involve themselves with Karaite legal literature in Judeo-Arabic. I think that a significant percentage of these individuals is to be found here today in this room. Today, I'm afraid I'm going to aggravate this state of affairs and introduce a new, rather unknown author, Ysrael Ben-Daniel, whose book will have to be added to the list I just mentioned. Actually, to maintain truth in advertising, I should say that I am reintroducing him, as I described him briefly about 15 years ago in an article on unknown Karaite works. So those of you who may recall that article can take a brief nap at this point. Ysrael Ben-Daniel was an early Karaite, and as I will try to show, perhaps the first known Karaite author to write in Judeo-Arabic. In the surviving fragments of his book, we find that the only earlier authorities he refers to are Anan and Binyamin al-Hawendi. He does not seem to have been aware of Al-Kirkisani, nor does it seem that Al-Kirkisani knew of him, at least not by name, although I will return to this issue. A further indication of his time is the fact that we find no mention of Saadia Gaon in his book, even though a frequently occurring element of the book is polemic with the Rabbinites, whom he simply refers to as the Rabbinites. Reaction to Saadia Gaon was a seemingly indispensable item in Karaite writing from Al-Kirkisani onwards. The absence of references to Saadia Gaon and the fact that Al-Nahawendi is the latest Karaite author mentioned already give us a sense that Ysrael Ben-Daniel was probably active in the latter part of the 9th century. Ysrael Ben-Daniel is mentioned in only a few sources. I'll begin with the later ones and move on to the earlier ones. Moshe Bashiatzi refers to him in his book Zevach Pesach and makes him into the son of Daniel Kumisi, and even suggests that both of them belong to the sages of Tustar. Bashiatzi did know that he wrote a book of law in Arabic and even quotes a passage. It is even possible that Bashiatzi made use of the same manuscripts which we now have in the Firkovich collections. Well, I don't think that there was a familial relationship between Al-Kumisi and Ysrael Ben-Daniel. We will have to investigate whether intellectual relationships may have existed. Bashiatzi also gave Yisrael's book the title Mitzvot Hashem Bara, although according to the surviving colophon, Yisrael gave it the rather creative title Sefer Mitzvot. More substantive references to Ysrael Ben-Daniel are to be found in Yefet ben Sagir's Sefer Mitzvot. Note that the creative title Sefer Mitzvot was still being used in the 14th century, and particularly in Shlomo ben David Hanassi's work on forbidden sexual relationships, his Makala Fila Arayot. We will be hearing more about Shlomo ben David Hanassi shortly after this talk, so I will describe his work only briefly. His Makala Fila Arayot is a rather large work, comprising hundreds of folios, completed in the year 1204. His method is that for every specific topic, he first quotes at length the opinions of his predecessors, more or less in chronological order, and only then does he discuss the issue and present his own opinions. As with most Firkovich manuscripts, the surviving manuscripts of Shlomo ben David's work are all jumbled up, and the book needs to be reconstructed in order to be truly useful. Nevertheless, it seemed that his usual order for quotation was Anan, Binyamin al-Nahawendi, Daniel al-Kumisi, al-Kirkasani, Ysrael ben Daniel, Saba ben Atzliach, Yefe ben Eli, Levi ben Yefet, David ben Boaz, Yusuf al-Basir, Abu Afarj Harun, Yeshua ben Yehuda, and leaving Saji Gaon to the end as the representative of the rabbinites. So if we are to trust Shlomo ben David's historical information, Israel ben Daniel would seem to have been after al-Kirkasani. Ibn al-Hiti, in his 15th century chronology of Karaite authorities, also tried to date Israel ben Daniel using Shlom Hanassi's book. But Ibn al-Hiti seems to have come to the conclusion that Yisrael preceded al-Kirkasani. There are, however, some textual problems at this point in Ibn al-Hiti's text, and the matter is not entirely clear. Nevertheless, the quotations in Shlomo Hanassi's Makala are very important for us. He has, for example, preserved significant sections of Anan's original Aramaic text. Al-Kumisi, however, he seems to have known only from the references in Al-Kirkasani's Kitab al-Anwar. His quotes from Yisrael ben Daniel are actually what enabled me to identify manuscripts of Israel's work, which I'll describe in a little bit. Our next source for Yisrael ben Daniel is Yeshua ben Yehuda's polemic against the Rabbinites, entitled Torat Zivalanu, which seems to have been one of his last works, perhaps written in the 1060s. One of the main topics of the book is, of course, the calendar and how to determine the beginning of the month. In this section, Yeshua quotes at length from Al-Kirkasani. After this citation, he writes, I quote, "I thought I would follow this with a passage from one of the defenders of the Karaite way of determining the months by citing the new moon. He is known as Israel ben Daniel. This passage is what he says in the Sefer Mitzvot, which he wrote in the land of the Maghrib, Balad al-Maghrib." End of quote. Following his citation from Yisrael ben Daniel, Yeshua then brings a lengthy Hebrew quote from Binyamin al-Nahawendi. It is tempting to suggest that Yeshua was citing his sources in reverse chronological order, having Yisrael precede al-Kirkasani. Yeshua ben Yehuda was a rather meticulous scholar who sought out a large variety of sources. For example, also when he had trouble understanding a Talmudic passage, he even went to the rabbinite Rosh Hashiva for elucidation. I, therefore, would tend to accept at face value his rather extraordinary statement that Yisrael ben Daniel was active in the Maghrib. We have very little information about Karaites in the Maghrib before the 11th century, and it is a bit surprising that there were Karaites there at the end of the 9th or early 10th centuries. The earliest Karaite I know of from North Africa is the philologist David ben Avram al-Fassi, who was active in the 10th century. Although Chaim Zev Hirschberg was of the opinion that al-Fassi was originally a rabbinite in Fez, who came under Karaite influence only after he came to Eretz Yisrael. From the 11th century, we have a variety of sources of evidence of a Karaite community in the desert oasis of Waraglan, including a letter from the year of 1041, and a manuscript of Salman ben Yeruchim's commentaries to Ruth and Shir Shirim, which was copied in Waraglan in the 12th century. There are, however, some responses of Shir Gaon and Hai Gaon from the late 10th and early 11th centuries, which seem to reflect Karaite cultural pressure. As an example, I would just mention an unpublished response by Hai Gaon, which he was asked about the simple meaning of the verse, "Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk." And how do we know that the meaning of this verse is that it is forbidden to cook milk and meat together? It is most likely that this response was sent to the Maghrib and shows that the Karaite presence there was strong enough to create doubts about some basic points of rabbinite law. With Yeshua ben Yehuda's information about Yisrael ben Daniel, it therefore seems that the beginnings of the Karaite community in the Maghrib date to the early days of the Karaite movement. It is most likely that these early Karaite settlers came to the Maghrib as part of the first general waves of migration from Iraq westward, which began at this time. This population movement was caused by the severe economic decline and subsequent social disorder which took place in the latter days of Abbasid rule in Iraq. The decline was in part the outcome of the neglect of the agricultural infrastructure, which resulted in widespread famine. It is only sensible the Karaites were among the large numbers of people who sought a better life in the Western lands. The fact that Yisrael ben Daniel was a Maghrebi allows us to return to Al-Kirkasani. Al-Kirkasani refers in Kitab al-Anwar with a certain frequency to the legal positions or traditions of a number of distinct Karaite groups, the Ananiya, the Tustaris, the Baghdadis, the Basrans, the Karaites of Khorasan, Jibal, and of Eretz Yisrael, but only one place does he refer to an opinion of, quote, one of the Maghrebis. In his discussion of the verse, Ervat avicha vervat imcha lo tegale, Al-Kirkasani reports that one of the Maghrebis from among our people maintains that the words Ervat avicha vervat imcha actually refer to the father's mother and the mother's mother. The word imcha should be read ke-imcha, like your mother. Similarly, in the verse Ervat achi avicha lo tegale el ishto lo tikrav dodatcha hi, the word dodatcha should be understood as kidodatcha. This is based on the idea that your father's brother's wife is not actually your aunt. Only your father's and mother's sister would truly be called your aunt. Therefore, your father's brother's wife is like your aunt and likewise forbidden to you. It does not appear that Yisrael ben Daniel's discussion of the verse Ervat avicha vervat imcha lo tegale has survived, or at least I could not find it. A search in the manuscripts did, however, come up with the discussion of the father's brother's wife, which turns out to be similar to what Al-Kirkasani reports. But therefore seemed possible that Al-Kirkasani was somewhat aware of Yisrael ben Daniel's book, or at least aware of the Maghrebi opinions reflected in it. Our last and earliest reference to Yisrael ben Daniel is found in an anonymous apologetic for the Rabbinite position. This work has been preserved in an Oxford Geniza fragment, Hebrew F18, folios 1 through 33. The manuscript was published in 1994 by the Egyptian Geniza scholar Muhammad al-Hawari, but even so, it still remains rather little known. I think that this work is, in itself, of historical importance. I will therefore devote a bit of time to describe it. Almost the entire work has survived. The first signature of the manuscript is missing the two outer bifolios, so we unfortunately don't have the first few pages of the book, and there is a gap after folio 8. Other than that, the folios are continuous to the end of the book and are well preserved. According to the Colophon, this copy of the book was made in the year 1112. On the first folio of the manuscript, we have the following passage. I quote, "My aversion to the Rabbinites, however, was only due to what I saw in their books, the diversity of interpretations, the controversies, and the disputes. But I really sank into the mire because of a group quite small in number, but of the most violent disputes, abominable interpretations, disgraceful ignorance, and most vile separativeness. For they adhere to a position which can be summarized by their statement, one Torah and one law." He quotes in Hebrew, Torah echat v'mishpat echat. They repudiate any book written according to the traditional interpretation and not according to the written Torah. They, however, produce a variety of books, differing explanations, and mutually contradictory interpretations. This began with Anan and continued with Binyamin and Malik, one after the other, until Abu Hatim al-Dhahabi, or perhaps al-Rahabi, and until this Ramlite, Yisrael ben Daniel. The author was not happy with the Rabbinites, but he really didn't like the Karaites. His critique of the Karaites' lack of unity, internal disagreements, and strange biblical interpretations was not unusual for a Rabbinite. His chronology of the Karaites, however, is of great interest. He begins with Anan and Binyamin Nahawandi, as is to be expected. He then mentions the little-known Karaite, Malika Ramli, who, like Binyamin, was also active in the middle of the 9th century, and evidently came from the town of Ramla. Most of what we know about Malik comes from Al-Kirkasani. The only thing really that Al-Kirkasani has to say about Malik is that he went to Jerusalem to swear that the Torim used in the temple sacrifices were chickens, and hence chickens were forbidden to be eaten, a claim that Daniel al-Kumisi also criticizes. Al-Kirkasani also relates that Malik had a group of followers known as the Ramliya or Malakiya. Our anonymous author then indicates that there were some other nameless figures, perhaps unknown to him, and then he comes to Abu Hatim al-Dhahabi, who is unknown from any other source. It ends with our Yisrael ben Daniel. The way he presents Yisrael ben Daniel as This Ramlite, gives us the sense that Ysrael was a contemporary of the author. The appellation Aramli he gives to Ysrael can have two meanings, which are not necessarily contradictory. One, it would seem to indicate that at the time this little book was written, Ysrael was resident in Ramla, or had resided in Ramla. Second, the term Aramli may indicate that Ysrael was a follower of Melech Aramli. Our author's chronology is also interesting for whom it leaves out. There is no mention of any of Al-Kumasi, Al-Kirkasani, or any of the later well-known Karaite figures. This could be for two reasons. The first, which to me seems to be the most likely, is chronological. This is simply a very early piece of writing. The other possibility is that the author was geographically distant from the Karaite centers in the east, perhaps living in the Maghreb, and was not aware of the contemporary developments. Even so, someone so aware of Karaite goings-on would have to be relatively early, if he doesn't mention Al-Kumasi or other early authorities. My own sense is that he was quite early, active in the latter part of the 9th century, and perhaps lived in Eretz Israel, a hypothesis strengthened by his reference further on to the Rabbinites' forefathers in Jerusalem. I should mention parenthetically that one word in the manuscript is written in Coptic letters, which might point to Egypt as the place of composition. Following his complaint against the Karaites, our author lists the five main areas in which later Karaites differed with the nun, even giving them a mnemonic device, calling them the 5 mems. There's Met, Moed, Milah, I can't remember the other two. After this, we are introduced to an anonymous interlocutor, evidently the person who had requested the author to write the book. Frequently in Arabic literature, such interlocutors are a mere fictional trope, used to reduce the author's sense of hubris. In this case, however, the way the author addresses the interlocutor is a bit too substantive and personal to be a fiction. We read as follows, I quote, "Moreover, concerning all of the forbidden sexual relationships in all of their various types, the laws of the Sabbath, purity and impurity, inheritance, purchase and sales, there is no group among them, the Karaites that is, who agree on one view, and there is but another group which disagrees with them. We have come to a state of conflict without agreement, of contrivances, inventions, and disruption. I, therefore, have to be astonished at your hypocrisy concerning my separation from them, or perhaps my leaving them, and you in particular. Perhaps you are afraid of the Rabbinites' malicious joy, that is, that the Rabbinites would rejoice at the Karaites' misfortune. And this induces you to overlook the defects of the Ramlite's commentary, and to have patience with his lying allegations and his claim of wisdom. Remember Solomon's saying, 'Answer a fool according to his folly, else he will think himself wise,' which is an indication that the fool is he who claims to have wise knowledge of God's correct book. According to knowledgeable people, he, the Ramlite, is in error. But according to you, this is absurd and a false accusation. But you have many times reported to us that you have seen Karaites, when they challenged the Rabbinites, apply to them the prophet's words, 'Those who are so wise in their opinions, so clever in their own judgment.' The Karaites, however, are even more similar to the prophet's rebuke, because of the great amount of praise each one has for the extent of his own intellect, the high degree of his comprehension, what he deems to be good according to his opinion. Moreover, you know this about them, and you are acquainted with the paucity of their instruction and their deficient knowledge of what the Rabbinites' forefathers in Jerusalem related, and the prophet's traditions about the inherited laws and the customary usages. Despite your expectation of a relief which will heal the rift in Israel and will illuminate their perception, how can you give importance to the distant ones replacing those who are close, and the recent ones replacing the ancient? By the distant ones, I mean those who have distanced themselves from the realm of the ancient times and whose language has changed from that of the ancestors. By those who are close, I mean those who were closer than us to the excellent forefathers and the righteous transmitters of tradition." After he has chastised his interlocutor, the author responds to the interlocutor's request for a proof of the veracity of Rabbinites' traditions, a proof which continues to the end of the book. Without going into the details of his argument, I would just say that it is based on the idea that not all knowledge, legal or otherwise, is to be found written in the prophetic books. And therefore, obviously, much of what we know comes from oral traditions. I would also point out that the author does not make use of the theoretical terminology we find in later discussions of tradition, which draws from the literature of Islamic legal theory, usul al-fiqh. I'd like to comment on two aspects of this passage. First, the reference to the Ramlite's commentary clearly intends Yisrael ben Daniel's book. The author cannot be referring to Malachi Ramli, as El-Kirkasani reports that he did not write a book. It is apparent that at the time and place this apologetic work was written, it was Yisrael ben Daniel's book that represented the Karaite positions and defined the contours of the debate between the Karaites and the Rabbinites. It would seem that in its time, the impact of Yisrael's Sefer Mitzvot was quite large. Second, I would point out that the author states in the beginning of the second passage that at an earlier point in time, he had separated from the Karaites in some sense. Does this mean that he had once belonged to the Karaite camp? Or perhaps only that he had decided to abandon any dialogue with them? The author's loyalty is clearly to the ancient Rabbinite traditions, which he only refers to in a general fashion. He does not refer to any authoritative texts or institutions, such as the Geonic Yeshivot. In any case, this apologetic work seems to have been written at a time when some, such as the interlocutor here, were still hoping to heal the rift between the Karaites and the Rabbinites, and thought to somehow accommodate the content of Yisrael ben Daniel's Sefer Mitzvot. This would point to a relatively early stage in the development of the Karaite movement when such a hope could still be entertained. Before turning to a description of the Sefer Mitzvot itself, I would like to summarize what we can learn from our sources. Yisrael ben Daniel appears to have been active in the latter part of the 9th century, perhaps a contemporary of Daniel Kumasi, or perhaps preceding him. He wrote his book in the Maghrib, but it seems quite possible that after composing his book, he moved to Eretz Yisrael, where he settled in Ramla, perhaps as an answer to the call of the nascent Avalei Tzion movement. Salman ben Yeruchim describes the development of Karaism in his commentary to Psalms. Salmon mentions Anan, Binyamin, the Karaites as a whole, and then the people from the east and the west, who were the Avalei Tzion. The west could certainly refer to the Maghrib and people like Yisrael ben Daniel. Now, concerning the book. A number of large fragments of the book have been preserved in the Firkovich collections. In addition, there is a 6-folio fragment in the British Library and a 10-folio fragment in the Taylor Schechter collection. The Firkovich manuscripts include Hebrew character manuscripts containing 45, 53, and 57 folios, as well as a number of smaller pieces. All of the Hebrew character manuscripts are in an early 11th century square script, mostly written on vellum. The one Arabic character script has 180 folios, is written on paper, and would seem to date from the late 11th century or early 12th century. The fact that all the copies are early indicates the text was indeed not used much by later Karaites. The manuscripts also have some orthographic peculiarities which I've seen in very few other manuscripts, and which perhaps point to a specific geographic region. One, there is a tendency to double vowel letters, such as the word kaum written with 2 vowels, the word bayit written with 2 yu's, and some remnants of phonetic orthography. Second, the letter kaf, when appearing in an Arabic word in final position, is not written in its final form. When it appears in a Hebrew word, however, it is written as a final kaf. And third, the word Allah is not written out fully, but as an aleph lamed ligature followed by a sign composed of a dot over a line over another dot, or simply a line over a dot. This may be the result of a desire not to write out the name of God, even in Arabic, similar to the various groupings of the letter Yud we have in Hebrew. This usage also appears in the manuscript of the anonymous apologetic work which I just described. If someone here has also seen such phenomena and has an explanation for them, I'd be very happy to hear about it. Since the manuscripts are fragmentary and in confused order, it is somewhat difficult to make clear statements as to the structure of the book. I must admit that I had hoped to have a preliminary edition of the surviving parts of the book prepared by the time of this workshop, but it involved more work than I had thought, and so such an edition remains a project for the future. Nevertheless, some observations can be made. It would seem that the purpose of the book was to define all commandments of the Torah, in addition to legal topics which were of current concern, such as laws of the Sabbath, impurity, holidays, forbidden relationships, the calendar, circumcision, and oaths, etc., Ysrael also discusses the commandments related to the temple and its sacrifices, or the laws pertinent to the Kohanim. In such places, he will comment that the commandment is not pertinent to, quote, our age, or, quote, we do not have a Kohen, or that the commandment only pertains to a time when Israel has political independence. The last 3 folios of an introduction have survived, which deal with the ways of proper interpretation of the biblical text, including various philological issues. Israel clearly saw philological knowledge as necessary for proper legal exegesis of the biblical text. Following the introduction, the first topic to be treated are the laws of the Sabbath, perhaps due to the appearance of the Sabbath in the beginning of the Torah and the story of creation. The typical section of the book begins with a statement that God has obligated or forbidden us such and such, and then he will quote the biblical proof text. The book is not systematically ordered and divided into sections and subsections as we find in later books of Karaite law, although I can suggest that perhaps the book roughly followed the order of the appearance of commandments in the Torah. It does seem that the commandments related to a specific topic were gathered together into one section. In one place, he does refer to what he calls Seder Tum'ot as a defined unit of the book. In this section, he divides impurity into 2 types, light, which lasts for 1 day, and heavy impurity, which lasts for 7 days. Light impurity is further divided into 12 types, and the heavy impurity is divided into 6 types. So he does have a tendency towards systematization. Other parts of the book, such as that on oaths, are also divided into sections, but this is not necessarily true of other parts. Many sections of the book end with a critique of the Rabbinite law on that particular topic, pointing out that the Rabbinite law contradicts the biblical text. For example, it mentions that the Rabbinites will not accept testimony from a relative or a woman, even though in the biblical passage concerning the rebellious son, the father and mother testify that their son has been acting improperly and does not listen to them. So you have both a relative and a woman testifying. There are instances, however, when he is willing not to accept the simple meaning of the biblical text. For example, in Exodus chapter 21, the Bible states that when a slave does not want to go free in the sabbatical year, his master has to make a hole in his ear, and the slave will then remain as he is. Israel claims that the Torah cannot mean what it seems to say, since it is forbidden to physically harm someone else. Instead, he gives a rather sermonic, or I could say midrashic, interpretation to the verse. I will give another brief example of his critique of the Rabbinites. At the end of his discussion of the laws of the temple and the menorah, he launches into a lengthy criticism of the Rabbinite conception of the synagogue as a mikdash ma'at. He claims that they make the synagogue into a holy place. By adding holiness to a place which is not the temple in Jerusalem, they are violating God's word. Israel's critique here is very similar to what Daniel Kumasi says about the Rabbinites' synagogue practices. Israel, however, also accuses the Rabbinites of burying people in the synagogue and making it like a cemetery, an accusation which I have not seen elsewhere. Israel's attitude to Rabbinite tradition was a bit more complex than simple criticism. He is willing to refer to it as the inheritance of the ancients, and he knew the Mishnah well enough to quote it by Seder, Masechet, and chapter, sometimes with quite extensive quotations. While he claims that the law can only be based on the biblical text, analogy based on the biblical text, or consensus, he also knew that tradition was sometimes important. For example, according to him, the types of locusts permitted to be eaten is known only by tradition, which he calls inheritance, miraf. His constant reference to Rabbinite law shows that in his time, the developing process of the self-definition of Karaite law was to a significant extent using Rabbinite halacha as a sort of mirror, showing what Karaite law is not. Israel seems to relate to Rabbinite law as a challenge, and indeed, in the beginning of the book, he says that one of his purposes is to respond to the Rabbinites and clarify their mistakes. I mentioned before that there are some similarities between Israel ben Daniel and Daniel Kumasi in their anti-Rabbinite rhetoric. In this, they both like to use biblical citations from the verse Mitzvot Anashim L'Mada to the creative use of many other verses. A further cultural similarity is the degree to which both had internalized theological ideas of the Mutazilite Kalam. The impact of the Mutazilan al-Kumasi has been demonstrated by Moshe Tzukar and by Chagai ben Shammai, and I will not take the time now to recapitulate what they have shown us. As for Israel ben Daniel, I will mention 2 examples. At the end of his discussion that Kohanim may not be drunk when serving in the temple, he says that actually anyone being drunk at any time is reprehensible, a matter which is known by the intellect and from Scripture. We are obligated to know God's unity, have true knowledge of Him and of Scripture. And this is what is meant by the verse, "Vayula totafot bein einecha." We will only achieve the knowledge which God has obligated us to acquire and act upon it, but through clear intellect and exacting distinction. Another place, in his discussion of leaving lamps burning on the Sabbath, Yisrael points out that a certain position would apparently leave a particular verse with no meaning or use. This, he says, would make the verse useless, in Arabic abath, something which cannot be attributed to divine action. The idea of useless activity not being possible of God is a quite mutazili notion. We can also discern Kalam's impact in the dialogical style of his writing and the method of his argumentation in certain parts of the book, which use the taksim type of refutation. This similarity between Al-Qumsi and Ysrael does not mean that there was a direct impact of one upon the other, but rather that both were part of a cultural development which saw the early and gradual internalization of Kalam ideas by significant parts of the Jewish population, both Rabbinite and Karaite. I think, though, that there might have been a conversation, quote, between Yisrael ben Daniel and Daniel Al-Qumsi on legal matters as well. This will require more investigation in the future. I will mention just one topic which might bear fruitful examination. Yisrael has a lengthy discussion of the question as to whether impurity can be transmitted through intermediary contact. For example, if a dead fly falls on a pot, and the pot is in contact with the food inside, is the food impure? Israel maintains that such transmission of impurity is possible. Al-Qumsi has a fairly long treatment of the same issue, for Al-Qumsi that is, apparently holding that it is not possible. But he does deal with a number of the same proof texts used by Israel. Al-Kirkasani also has a lengthy discussion of the topic, and interestingly enough, he reports that the position that such transmission is possible is basically an opinion of the Ananiya. This is an indication to us that there is still much to be done in investigating the context and interactions between the various elements of the Karaite movement in the latter part of the 9th century and early 10th century. As I pointed out at the beginning of my talk, the scholarly exploitation of the Karaite legal literature in Judeo-Arabic has just barely begun. The dynamic of the development from the extremely wide diversity of opinions we find in the early period to the creation of something approaching a consensus across the broad range of legal topics in the 4th, 14th, and 15th centuries needs to be carefully examined and explicated. Also, the relationship between the legal literature and exegetical works also requires careful examination. With the addition of Yisrael ben Daniel's Sefer Mitzvot to the bookshelf, I'm afraid that the task has become a bit more complicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Comments? Great.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. Very interesting work, and very interesting what you said, especially about Yisrael ben Daniel being so early. And in light of the earlier discussion today and yesterday about the rise of the concept of the author, and the idea that the question about when concepts of authorship sort of trickled into Karaite or the consciousness of Jews in general. I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about that introduction, or about what Yisrael ben Daniel could contribute to our discussion on the issue.
Well, because only a small part of the introduction has been preserved, the very end of it, and it appears to, at least part of the introduction was devoted to actually matters of exegesis and philology, and because he has a long discussion of homonyms and Hebrew shorshim, where the consonants change, etc. But it doesn't really. He doesn't really reflect. There's no authorial reflection, the sort that you're looking for, at least in what's survived there.
And inside the work, comments to the reader, things like this.
No, it doesn't really. I mean, it's clearly there's a sense of authorship in the book. He doesn't at any point turn to the reader, but it's clearly it's his book. It's not let's say reflection of any oral activity beforehand, whatever. It's definitely a good book.
And so according to what you're saying also, the introduction details a sort of different type of examination than what actually occurs in the book, because the book is more halakhic.
Well, like any, particularly any early Karaite work, a legal work is exegesis. And it's clear to him that you need to have proper exegetical knowledge in order to discuss legal matters, and it's all based on exegesis of the necessary verses.
I just wondered, is Rabbi Israel ben Daniel the same person who's identified Israel Ma'aravi?
No, he's an early 14th century author.
Okay.
Wrote a book on Shlita and a few other things.
Okay, so I'll discuss with you some other later.
A couple of questions. In the bibliography, I listed, there are two encyclopedia articles about him, one by Marcon and one by Poznansky, and I listed him as 11th century, so I'm assuming that that's a mistake, or unless there's another later Israel Ben-Daniel.
Mordechai Kukuzov, and Dod Mordechai places him in the 11th century.
Okay.
So later historians followed him.
Okay, so that needs to be adjusted according to...
Something for the website.
For the, yes, okay, additions and corrections. And I had one other question about Sefer Mitzvot in general, and whether the Karaites had a concept of Minyana Mitzvot, like the Rabbinites with the Taryag. Did they try to count the Mitzvot and establish a fixed number, or does the number vary from one Sefer Mitzvot to another?
There's no attempt to enumerate Mitzvot. And also, after Simon Daniel, all the other Sefer Mitzvot I'm aware of don't attempt to discuss all the Mitzvot. They're halachic works. They're discussions of topics that were of concern to Karaites now.
If I'm not mistaken, you said that he was working in the 19th century, yes? The time of Kumsi?
That's what I think.
So this has a far-reaching consequence that, the beginning of Karaism, and in the West, one can write a very elaborated book about halakha. So it's really something.
Yes, I agree with you.
It's it's a question how, if you are speaking about, Anan, Binyamin, Kumsi, you can understand the process. And here in the West, so early, it's really make you think maybe it's...
Well, we really don't know his biography. I mean, it's possible that he was born in the East and migrated to North Africa, wrote his book, then came back to Eretz Yisrael.
But most of the dates you gave for the Maghreb were already close to 1,000, right? When you talked about emigration from Iraq and...
Well, the general immigration from Iraq begins like in the late 9th century. The 10th century really sees a tremendous migration. In general, Muslims, Christians, Jews from the east to the west.
So there was one remark about Barry's question about the enumeration. The very notion of a specific number, like 613, is so rabbinic that it could never have been accepted by Karaites. It's just impossible. They don't have the need to cling to a certain maximum which was formed centuries earlier by a rabbinic authority. So they cannot feel any commitment to such a notion. And, on the contrary, because it's so rabbinic,
We could have had another number.
No, the number is to be differentiated mideoraita or miderabanan. Karaites don't have miderabanan, does not need to...
But fact that it's an order, you think that it's an order of the Torah, the way they appear in the Torah would also be unusual in a Karaite.
Yeah, that's unusual. For example, it seems when he deals with many of the commandments in Parshat Mishpatim, he follows the order of as the appearance in Parshat Mishpatim. So, but it's hard to say until the book has been reconstructed. The whole orders.
Thank you very much.